Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Crown Unfiltered, the internet's premier car design podcast. This week we're going to be doing something a little bit different and we are going to be focusing on product design. My guest today is a gentleman by the name of Adam White. He's the co-founder and director of multidisciplinary, multi-award-winning international creative design agency Factory Design in London. Adam and his partner Adrian started Factory more than 25 years ago and have designed everything from motorcycles to executive sellotape dispensers. They have also, over that period of a quarter of a century, established themselves as one of the world leaders in aircraft interior design. I probed Adam about every single step of that process, from the design process to establishing a business in a very cutthroat industry. I also probed him on the key to creating a successful creative team. And it seemed to be that it was something along the lines of the Richard Branson ethos of empower people to the point that they can go anywhere, but treat them so well that they choose to stay. We'll start. I'll prompt you to introduce yourself and say who you are and whatever, but it's pretty informal and it's pretty relaxed. I don't know if you saw any of the other episodes, but it's very.
Yes, I did. Thanks. I watched a bit of one end of last year, and then I saw Adrian Morton yesterday, which was nice to see. I remember when I was at Seymour Powell, he came in for a little while.
Right.
Poor chap.
Right. Yes. Well, yeah. We've heard some stories, shall we just say? Well,
yes, I bet you have.
So Adam, we obviously this is primarily a car design podcast, but I consider us all to kind of be within the family of industrial design, shall we say. And we've had a lot of requests to have people from outside of the car world. So product design is definitely one of them. And I thought it would be a great opportunity to invite you on because we've, I don't know you, but I've been aware of Factory Design ever since I was a student, really. So it's nice to have you on. And could you just give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do?
I will keep it brief. So I am by training a industrial designer. And I thought the debate about quite what to call the degree you do when it's in this field had gone away a long time ago, and it was just kind of product design. But I discover people still argue on the courses. Is it product design engineering? Is it industrial design, et cetera, et cetera? I've kind of over the years got used to calling it 3D. And in a way, it's mutated for me in the last 20, 25 years because I started off entirely in the world of product design, as in I left university with my degree and I lucked out and got a job at Pentagram in the early 80s. And at the time, that was the sort of holy grail for a product designer. Though I did my degree up in Leicester and all I did was either party or work on my degree. And luckily for me, I did love the course. So I did learn a reasonable amount there, and I think that they were very good. There were very good people there to teach, I guess. And actually the cohort of students were good because we were very competitive with each other. And so I landed up back in London and I went to work for Pentagram. I worked for Kenneth Grange, who was, kind of at maximum throttle because it was the 80s. And I joined, and there were, I think, 4 others in his team, because the model of Pentagram then, as it is now, is that there's partners in different disciplines, each with a little group that they run. and I left, I don't know, 5-6 years later. And by that time, there were probably a dozen people in Kenneth's team. And I was one of the senior people by then, running a couple of guys. And it had been just a lightning and exciting time during the 80s. But I was very aware that I was in the old school, what by then was already the kind of traditional, it was very well organized, incredibly professional business. And there was an upstart group called Seymour Powell that Kenneth particularly complained about. So naturally, they were very attractive to me. And they've been in the press so much. I went along for an interview. They were advertising pre-internet back at Design Week. And I went along for an interview, and I was amazed that it was a tiny little studio with, I think, 4 or 5 guys plus Dick and Richard. But it was filled with energy and a few guns and motorbikes, and I couldn't think of anywhere more exciting to be in my mid-late 20s. So off I went, and I was drafted in as a professional because I'd worked in a company that had drawing numbers and understood protocols and all that sort of stuff. Protocols of design. So, I was suddenly being used in that way at Seymour Powell, and it was the most liberating place for me to go to from where I had been, because there were no boundaries, particularly for Richard, who would get involved in absolutely anything that he could, that he wanted to. And I took a lot from that. And that was where the stretch from product design sort of started to grow. And I left that company some years later as an associate partner of that place. And I had spent the previous few years working for Yamaha and BMW, and I designed trains and just all sorts of stuff. And it's because the kind of skill set you get as a product designer, you see those skill sets in lots of other different areas of design. It's just back then there were a couple of silos that you lived in, and there are many more now with UX, etc., etc. But I climbed out of my silo, and in the spirit of what was in the early days a very pushy and exciting company to work at, I started to play with other toys.
Adam, what pushes you to leave a place like that? Did you just feel like you've done your time and you wanted to move on, or did you always have a vision for having your own place?
It's a good question, Sam. I think, and I've often told people over the decades, don't imagine that the natural course is to start your own consultancy. And I've often told them that because there's some brilliant jobs that you can do working for somebody else. That when you start your own company, you've still got a job. It's just you've got a lot of bosses. And it's bloody hard work, frankly, for all sorts of complicated reasons we may or may not come on to. But in terms of what provoked me to leave, companies, a lot of successful design businesses, and there aren't many, in and around London and the UK, but a number of them are called after the people who run them and are driven by the sort of the ego and the determination, the willful determination of the owners to make a name for themselves. And that serves some of them incredibly well. The very best known and most successful companies in my line of work have got very single dominant figures, and I'll throw in again the word egos. However, that does come with collateral damage to people who work there. And whilst I'd been made an associate partner, as had a friend of mine who'd come along on the same journey, who also left Pentagram and started working at Seymour Powell, there's a point at which you feel like a bitch. And that's the modern parlance. We used to call it a flack catcher. But and there's a point at which you just think, hell, I'm carrying a lot of burden here. I might as well do it for myself. And frankly, the company had grown since I and the chap who became my business partner, the company had grown from half a dozen people to 30 something, and had moved, possibly bought, I can't remember, certainly had a ruddy great big office and workshop, and it had absolutely changed profoundly in the 8 or 9 years I was there. And it just felt like, well, let's have a go and see what happens if we try and do this ourselves. And the very first thing that went into the kind of definition of how we wanted to do business was it was not going to be called after us. It was going to be called something that was associated with industry and indeed manufacture, because that is, we are in a way commercial artists as opposed to painters. There is art in what we do, I feel, but there's also engineering. And so factory design just felt like a very egalitarian name. And we talked a lot, this is now 25 years ago, about collaboration. And it's been in everyone's byline for a few years now, but 25 years ago, that wasn't the case. It genuinely was quite a new idea that you worked with your client when you were working for your client. And with some people it resonated quite well, and these days it's normal. But Adrian and I were very clear that we did not want it to be the Adam and Adrian show. We wanted it to embrace other people either coming into the company or other businesses that we worked with. And there was quite a lot of collaborating, and still remains the case to this day.
I've got a million questions. The first thing, as you've just mentioned it, is the name Factory. Was there any Andy Warhol reference there?
Well, you kind of got me there. I did, as mad, the New York factory was completely bonkers, drug taking and naked most of the time.
Well, it was the 80s. Yeah. Okay.
No, but we did kind of enjoy that slightly nuanced take on something that was actually about machine and industry. So tiny bit.
It's a very, very cool name. I mean, and it just looks so great in the font as well. It's just like very powerful, and I've never forgot it. So
no,
it definitely works. Adam, I actually years ago, you won't remember it because I'm sure you get a million job applications. I did actually apply for a job there. And I never got a response, but that's probably because of the quality of my portfolio at the time. So I don't hold any grudges, but I at the time, this is around 2009. I remember there was you guys. Obviously there was Seymour Powell, which by this stage was already a well established machine. and then there was Priestman Good at the time as well, and also Tangerine, and there was a little green product design consultancy called Sprout. And it blows my mind that that you guys are that a product, not you guys specifically, but that a product design consultancy can still exist in the center of London today. Has there ever been any temptation to get out and save money on rent?
Well, in the last 2 years, a bloody big determination. But no, we're still here. Do you know, it is weird, but just let me get back to your lack of response from a job application. Genuinely, I'm surprised because we do get applications weekly and sometimes quite a lot a week, but we do try pretty hard to respond to everybody. So I genuinely apologise for that. You should have got a response.
It's no problem at all. It's no problem.
Interesting. 2009, we were a year or 6 months into what became the biggest job we've ever had, which was working for Etihad Airlines and literally charging back and forth between Abu Dhabi and London weekly, certainly every couple of weeks. It was a mad time. Anyway, the bigger bit of the question about London and staying here and what keeps you here. The weird thing is, so we decided probably 15 years ago, maybe a little less, maybe 12, that we wanted to push the business in terms of who we're seen as into aviation across the board. Didn't mean we wanted to stop doing product design. It was just aviation was brilliant. I mean, it was and remains brilliant. And in London, two that you mentioned, Tangerine and PG, they were at it and had been for some time and doing brilliant work. And then there's a couple of other businesses who also were involved and remain involved in aviation. We had a lucky break in our very early days when we'd worked for BA on a few jobs. And actually, the last big job that we did at Seymour Powell was working for an airline. And I can't remember that project went anywhere, but it was just a cracking job. You know, the fun of working. As a product designer, you work on that sort of point of interaction quite often between your hands and the object, whatever it is. And it's about the ergonomics and the touch and the feel and how it responds and all of those things. But of course, the bigger picture, when you extrapolate that out into an interior, that becomes a much bigger place to think about and therefore a much more exciting place to be. So back to your point, in London, there are 5 or 6 design agencies who in fact, most of whom were specialising way ahead of us. And we do most of the world's commercial aviation. And there are not many territories that collectively we're not involved in, literally around the globe. You're on email or whatever, with China or the Middle East or the US or even Europe, on a regular basis. And it's just a town. It just comes out of this little city in the UK. It's extraordinary. And I've talked to people about it in the past. I think that the design education that was going through UK universities in product design, and indeed the maturing of the transport design that was coming out through Coventry and the Royal College and other places, that just created the perfect design skill base for us collectively to be able to do aircraft really well, and so that's where we are. London is the place to be.
Is things still going? I mean, are things still as good as what they were in the early days when you guys started out?
I would say in a lot of respects better. I think that the aviation industry itself needed to understand how to use people like us, and we needed to mature in our knowledge of how to support and work for the aviation industry, because you can't study that one at university. You can do car design or toaster design or whatever it is, but aviation is incredibly specialized, and it's a Rubik's cube of problem solving to get to that point where all six sides are the same color, and you've delivered, and you follow literally every step of that way. So it's incredibly fulfilling, I guess, as something to work on.
Adam, we'll come back to aircraft interiors in a second, because it's very, very complex and obviously very interesting. But I think sometimes as car designers, we might view product design as something that's very simplistic, whereas looking from the outside, at least, because I've never worked as a product designer, that within a car studio, everyone's got a very specific role, as in an exterior design. I'm simplifying it now, but an exterior designer will draw or come up with the exterior theme, and then there's a person like myself that will build it. There will be an engineer, and then there's a whole color materials team that will decide on those things. My understanding is that product designers generally do most of that stuff themselves. I wonder if you could just explain to me the process of what you would do as a product designer in a consultancy setting.
There's a little division in the studio along the lines of what you described. So there's the kind of obvious divisions, I guess, which is skill sets. You've got somebody who's terrific at engineering, for instance, and somebody who's a cracking stylist. So there's those natural skill separations that occur. But we also have trim and finish. But trim and finish happens in parallel, I guess, to the developments that happen conceptually to what you're doing in the cabin. And indeed, so you move forward with the sort of concept ideas at the same time as you're moving forward your engineering knowledge and understanding. And that engineering pool may well go back and forward between you and part of the group you're working with. Always you find on a big aviation job that you know more about what's going on that aircraft than anyone else involved, the client, the manufacturers, the maintenance, etc., because you're talking to everybody. And as much as you've got a very specific client who's made up of different elements of if it's an airline, of the airline, you're also liaising and discussing about the pressure points with whoever's got to make each of those different parts. So a number of different makers. You've got an airframe builder, the actual aircraft, and then you've got the interaction and of maintenance crew and how they need to get to clean a filter or whatever. But more significantly than that, you've got the integration of the service style. So that might seem like a slightly nebulous thing, but the way that a crew interacts with the passenger the customer, as it were, that's different culturally as you work your way around the world. And so the product that you're designing, and therefore the furniture and the interior, needs to provide the platform or the stage on which the crew are able to deliver the service. So you need to implicitly understand all of these different things to bring together the bigger picture of what the design will be. It's a complicated process, but in the old analogy of spinning plates on a stage is one that will always be used by us because that's what we do, and that in terms of satisfaction, that's the most exciting thing when you've got them all going at the right speed.
How long does your typical project last for an airline?
I would guess 12, 18 months.
And do you generally get signed off like for the whole job prior to starting? It's not like, okay, Adam, can you and your guys do a little bit over here, and then it kind of evolves as it goes along. I mean, you've obviously got a business to run and people to pay, and you've got overhead, so it requires some planning.
Yeah, you tell that to my clients.
So,
do you know, it works very typically at stage by stage in terms of sign off. We would normally always have sight of the full scope, and we would normally produce an estimate time frame for a program, and that might be 18 months to do a new business class seat, for instance. If we're doing a whole cabin interior, it might be 24 months. We worked for Etihad for the original contract, I would guess, was probably 12 or 18 months, and it was for 9 years, because we became part of a collaborative group of, designers and client, as it were, working together, and all sorts of other people that picked up the baton of the future of that airline. And whilst it started on one aircraft type, which was a ruddy great big project because it was the biggest plane at the time, the 380, and remains the biggest, it was natural for us to then roll out and support the design of other aircraft and indeed other product for the airline.
Do you guys collaborate with any of the other consultancies that we mentioned earlier on these projects? I mean, are they in the airline space still today, or have things changed?
They both are, and they're both very successful in their areas. We pitch against them sometimes.
Okay.
And the two you've mentioned, no, we haven't worked with them. No reason technically not to. And we've certainly worked with others who we would consider competitors, but a client, on a particularly big program, and I mean a whopper, the client felt that it was too big for a single agency to do, and we, having pitched our way up to try to win this job, and went out, met the CEO, and he said, guys, I think it's just too big for you or the others who've come through. So you two go fly home. You got 24 hours, come back, tell me how you're going to work together. And we did that. And the people who we had been trying very hard to give Chinese burns to suddenly became our absolute buddies, and we worked together. And, it was a seamless and delightful thing because they're like us. We are similar types of people. We like the same things. We know the same people, etc., etc. So we worked perfectly happily with them for years.
It's such a beautiful thing. I mean, you would think from the outside looking in that, there's no ways that I can be friends with a competitor. But I mean, as you said, it it makes no sense not to be friends with those people.
Yeah. Yeah. Because we all came out of the same pool, went to the same colleges, are part of the same professional organizations. Half the time, one of your people will go and work for one of them and you'll nick one of theirs back. It's an incestuous and very small group of people. And the only ones, in my experience, because we know everybody we know all of the directors of these businesses, typically, we've grown up with them. And the only ones who aren't interested in collaborating are the ones who are very driven to be, successful in their own way, as it were. They don't have the egalitarianism that called us factory design,
Can you just, okay, I've got two questions. The first one is, on that subject where you guys are all pitching against each other, how long did it take for you to realize what the kind of right balance was in terms of quoting, to remain competitive with the other people, but yet obviously it's got to make sense for you, right? So I imagine that the people that you were competing with must have all been in a ballpark somehow.
Yeah, it's a tricky one, and it's not one we always get right. I would say that if you turn that around and look at what it is that makes a client choose you, it's often not about the price alone.
Right.
Within the decision-making group of people at the client, somebody will be very concerned about price, but other people will be concerned about track record, a number of other things, the kind of nature of your proposal, but really very importantly, is there an existing relationship with somebody? And often there is. And we refer when pitching often to, well, is this a real pitch or are they benchmarking us?
Right.
Have they got someone they want to use, but procurement has told them you've got to put it out to tender 3 to 5 businesses, or however many it is, and then you're just benchmarking. But in terms of working out cost, one of the things that we learned, or rather that we began factory design with, was a belief that you need the right people to do the right job. So of the logo that you mentioned, I had a very good friend who was running Pentagram, running a graphic design agency. Day one, we talked to him. This is what we think we'll call ourselves. And he created the typography, etc., etc. When it came to running a business, myself and my and the other founder partner, Adrian Berry, we were running big clients for Seymour Powell, and we knew quite a lot about quite a lot of things, but we recognized that really we could use a business partner. And within 12 months, we had met somebody who was trained as a product designer and had worked as a product designer for a few years. He'd then gone to the Design Council for 5 years, running up part of a bit of the Design Council. And then he had ended up at Pentagram, which is how we come to meet him. And he was a new business guy. And he could work Excel and all that kind of mysterious. And he knew what Sage was. That's the old one, the accountancy one, not the modern one.
Okay.
And we knew we needed his business knowledge. So we estimate a job because we have somebody who actually looks at hours and rates and does a proper calculation, whereas I think about it and will throw out a number. I'm often not far off. And invariably, Peter Tennant, who's our MD, he will always be a little higher than me. He's an eternal optimist. But it is, it's a complicated thing, but in a way it can be made very simple. Back to your original question about cost and estimating.
I think like it's one thing quoting an hourly rate as a freelancer. It's another thing doing it as a business, because you are, you've got to remain competitive, obviously, but at the same time, you aren't necessarily going to be doing work all the time, and you've got overheads that need to be paid even when money's not coming in. So you've got to, I think, you probably along the way you lose some jobs because you might overquote, or you end up doing something for less money than it is expected, and then you lose out in the long run anyway.
Yeah, it is very difficult. Yeah.
You have to excuse my ignorance on this. You were talking about the partnership model, and again, this is more about a business question than anything else. My question is, why, from a selfish, greedy capitalist point of view, not that I'm that person, but just thinking like that, why would you as a business owner say to an employee that I'm going to give you a part of the business? How exactly does the partnership work?
If you're talking about somebody who's going to become a partner that you give part of the business, that's to do with, I guess, how you're viewing what your company is. So if your company is all about you and your name is above the door, I suspect you're less likely to want to share the equity and responsibility. As I said, we were keen from the day that the company formed as an idea, let alone became limited. We were keen that we would collect partners, and every time we did, we would share equity with that person, so that we would all have equal ownership and responsibility. I think, I've been an employee. I've had 2 proper jobs in my life. And I understand the pitfalls and indeed the benefits of being on a wage, as it were. And I think ownership, I think it's a valuable thing. On the one hand, there's monetary value there. And on the other hand, there is value in terms of how you feel about the business and as an employee, and what your commitment is to that business and where you're going to go in the future. So along with equity partners or an additional equity partner in the company, a few years ago now, we decided to give all of the employees at the time who'd been with us for any length of time equity in the company. And other than it took a year and a half and a bloody fortune with lawyers, we did end up giving equity to each of the kind of key employees of the company, so that they benefited, if you like. And that in turn leads on to what is the succession, if there is a succession in a company, where you hope that people will stay long enough and build up enough enthusiasm to pick up the reins when you move on, assuming you don't want or try to sell the company. And over the years, I've seen there was a period a few years ago where a number of design businesses were bought, and that was at a time when there was an interest in that idea from a business point of view. I think it's mostly been successful when one design business blends with another design business, and whichever way the money or the equity goes, however that is resolved, the result of it is that you've got a bigger organization. And obviously, the bigger that organization becomes, the more it's capable of doing. However, it's a pretty hungry mouth to feed. And the last 2 years have taught anyone who had ever doubted it that when business is light in a consultancy, you have to dig into your savings fund.
Yeah. I mean, that's the obvious thing. I mean, I understand the concept of if you give an employee a equity, for example, there's a sense of ownership there. So as you said, there's an incentive for them to stay on longer. There's hopefully also an incentive for them to work harder because they actually feel like, well, hang on a second, part of this business is actually mine. So it tends to change your mindset, and that's very smart. I wonder, like, is there a tipping point where it all just becomes a total disaster? I mean, like, I'm talking more specifically on the subject of the whole partnership model. I mean, I ask you because I have no idea, and I hope I don't come across like a complete fool. But that whole business model, I mean, I don't understand it. I mean, from a simplistic standpoint, if I was going to start a business tomorrow, I would maybe pick like one, maximum two other people that I feel complement my skill set, like maybe a hardcore business person and I don't know, maybe a hardcore marketing person. And between the three of us, we could, have a pretty strong foundation in terms of company management or ownership. But, at what point is the thinking just that the more partners we get, the bigger we'll be able to come, and therefore the more money we'll be able to get? Is that a very simplistic view of looking at it?
I think, as you said at the start, it's a perfect capitalist model. But it is more complicated than that. So when Adrian and I started Factory Design, we had not forgotten how brilliant it was at Pentagram in the old days when there was graphic design, product design, architecture. I mean, essentially, those were the three things that you might have done at a degree, as a degree. Of course, graphic design broke down into a whole bundle of different things, and branding, etc., etc. And within the graphic partners at the time we were there in the 80s, the different partners had different specializations: typography, newspapers, etc. But I'm sorry, I'm trying to remember the thread of your question.
I know it was very woolly, but it was basically just the thinking behind acquiring more partners. But I mean, it completely depends on how you look at it. I think you guys were looking at it as like, we are going to acquire partners, whereas my simplistic looking at it is like, I'm just going to give away more of my little thing that I'm building. So
but there you go. That's it. That is a fundamental. That's one of the pillars of the business that you might set up. One of the pillars of the business that Adrian and I set up was that we would offer the opportunity to expand, because we weren't building our ivory tower. What we wanted to do was that we had worked at two companies, and we felt that there was another way to do things. There was another way to interact and operate, and key to that was a collaborative approach, and that came out of the fact that design consultancy had only been around a couple of decades at the most when we kicked off with Factory. The concept of a design consultant in the 60s was a pretty damn new concept, and it was only really in the 70s people were getting that language. So we're now a few decades later setting up a company, and we're feeling, well, the industry's matured. The interaction of a client with a consultant is better understood. We didn't want to be tarred with any of the formative brushes of felt tip fairies that engineering would refer to the designer. And then, my God, there's so many other marvelously derogatory terms that get thrown at the designer by different parts of the professional side of a client. And so we felt that our foundation, the pillars of the foundation of factory design, was not about creating an ivory tower for the founders. It was about creating a business, a machine that could really do damn good design work. That's what we aspired to. So at any moment that we needed something we didn't have, we would find someone to do it. A graphic designer to design our logo, a partner to help run the business, because Adrian and I were creative, and so we had no idea about running a business, but we accepted that and got on with it.
On the subject of partners, and specifically about the business partner, I guess we don't want to disrespect the person in question, but did you ever at some stage later on question whether or not it would have been better to get somebody that is from not with no creative experience at all, that comes from like a hardcore business background?
No, I've never questioned either of the other two partners at Factory Design. I've considered that we could always use more, which they just haven't been along, come along and actually joined. There have been a number of people over the decades who we've had some quite interesting conversations with, but it just hasn't come up. We're not driven entrepreneurs here, sadly. None of us have got that mission, really. We're very driven to try and do a cracking job for people, and are very aware you never stop learning, because frankly our business never stops evolving. I guess that kind of answers the question.
Yeah, no, it absolutely does, Adam. It absolutely does. I mean, could you like on a very like layman's terms level unpack a couple of the like, what were the mechanics of you actually starting Factory Design? So let's take into account that you were living in a pretty expensive city. I know it wasn't as expensive as what it is today, but it was definitely an expensive place. But you've got overheads that you needed to take care of right off the bat, and there was obviously very little, if any, remote working at that time. So, like, how do you say, okay, Frank, why don't you leave your job and join me? I'm going to make you a partner. How can you explain? Can you just talk about those early steps?
Yeah, I think life is about more than work.
Yes.
Work is an activity to make money.
Yes.
And I think over the decade or so, I have been working for other people. One of the people who I had spent increasingly a lot of time with was Adrian, who together we set this business up. And that was because quite apart from making money, which we thought is bound to happen one day, we thought it'd be really good fun in our lives to not be responsible to other people, but to be able to have a go at running a company together. And it was with the most honest, open-eyed naivety that we launched into it. We were doing perfectly well, and we had great jobs at our previous company. But that wasn't enough for us. We wanted to sort of, not just, so we had gone all over the place with clients in terms of the new type of work we were doing that I've already described. But I think there is a freedom in what you do from when you get up to when you go to bed. And I think we had questioned more about lifestyle. And God knows we put in enough effort to get things moving. But I remember back to my first 5 or however many years working for other people, we used to work bloody hard for them. Lucky sods that they were. It was very routine to be in at weekends or to not leave till 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night for weeks. No one does that anymore. And I think we kind of spent a lot of time doing, working pretty darn hard. And we wanted to get more out of that big part of your life, working. And it felt like the best way to do that was to do it on our own.
Brilliant.
So to set it up, we both set aside a degree of money in hindsight, and by today's standards, bugger all really. And we handed our notice in and then realised we had to stay there for a couple of months till the notice period was up, which was a bit tense, if I'm honest.
I can imagine, especially with those guys.
Yeah, absolutely. But it is what it is. And we left on a Friday, went to, buy lamps and desks and a couple of iMacs and set up over that weekend in the building that we'd found. And at the time, somebody very kindly offered us to borrow a small kind of warehousey building on the King's Road in Chelsea.
Just borrow?
Down the cheap end. Well, yeah, it was a building that they were renting, a little industrial building that had been a London Electricity Board service building. It was about the size of 2 houses in a side street. And it's where they would service generators. So it was the height of a 3-story house inside with kind of RSJ beams and hooks for chains. And I mean, it was an industrial space. So it was a cracking place for factory design to start.
Cool.
And we were there for a year and a half, I guess. And then we moved to this place and have been here ever since.
And Adam, did you guys have a client lined up for your first by the time you established the company or not?
Absolutely not. No. We thought we would, but we were entirely respectful of the kind of contract that we had with SP, and so we poached no clients, as it were. But we at the time, we had both been running quite big bits of business for them, and we imagined people would knock on our door. And it took a little while. It took longer than we thought it would, but people did start to knock on the door eventually. And I guess within a year and a half, we were up and running and paying for things.
Fascinating. Adam, I know your time's very valuable. Before you go, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about some of the tools that you guys are using and how they're changing. I mean, like everyday tools in terms of like if we go back to what your business is centered around, which is design, product design, and UI and UX as well. What are the things that you guys are using
in terms of software?
Software, but also like, are you guys experimenting with VR at all?
Okay, yeah, we have. I mean, we did that years ago, and we've kept in touch with it. The basic design tools upstairs are SolidWorks, Rhino, Blender, that sort of hardware, or software rather, and these things, you got to draw, and there you go. And I remember when we transitioned, because at Seymour Powell, Dick Powell was one of the early adopters of computers and an early fan of Apple. And he would turn up thrilled with the latest little kind of box from Apple that you could shove a floppy disk in on a good day. But I remember going along with them to a training day on computers, and because we all used drawing machines, it was still pen and pencil. It's not long ago either. When we set up Factory 25 years ago, we were very happy to have a couple of drawing machines that somebody said, you can have those if you want, in the studio, because we'd been schooled in using, in drafting the old-fashioned way. And indeed, I'd spent a couple of years designing motorcycles, and I had an 8x4 feet in old money drawing board, because I was doing full-size chassis drawings. I had started to use a 2D program, CAD program, and I felt really quite adventurous on my tiny little box working away in whatever it was. So, the sort of collateral that we use starts with a pen and ends with virtual spaces you can walk around, I guess. And whilst we do a lot of it here, if we're going to do a fly-through, for instance, we'll give the asset of the interior to somebody to then run it after we've choreographed it.
Okay, so you'll outsource that like high-end visualization work.
Yeah, we don't have to, but what we don't like to do, because we're a small business, dozen people, and we don't want to tie up. And it's a funny thing, it's always changing, isn't it? We've been adding to this tower, a second tower, to have a farm over the road, because we've got another building, to do the rendering. But increasingly, graphics cards can turn stuff around so damn quick that we're looking at putting stuff onto the cloud. And we've got half the business on the cloud already, but we've always held off from the kind of rendering CAD side, because we've got big machine over the road. But I think that's going out of date very quickly.
Yeah, it's incredible. I mean, what's happening now at the moment, as you say. I mean, you don't even need to have a physical machine in your building, which is mind blowing. So yeah, just need an internet connection.
Yeah, indeed.
Mad. Adam, what is the future for factory design? Do you guys have a limit to how big you want to get, or is the sky the limit?
Do you know, in the old days, I'd have grabbed onto the sky's the limit, because that's what we thought, and that's what we meant then. But we have noticed over the years, and we've been larger than we are now in the past when we needed to be. But we've yet to have encountered another partner to join the three of us who offers what we would need for them to become part of the business. It's not that we're hugely selective, it's just perhaps the people who are prepared to run their own show largely stick running their own show. But longer term, I think we see the company now as being taken over by the people who are here, who are helping it become, be what it is. It's from the first moment we employed somebody, the company was about more than the two founding partners, and every person we've ever employed, and there's, I don't know, 60, 70 people or whatever, they have been part of Factory Design's journey. Any company is the sum of its parts, and it is still the case that the media damn well loves to talk about the designer, but the reality is there's the designer whose name is on the page, who's running the show, typically, but there's always so many other people involved, and we do like to acknowledge that, and the kind of starting point of acknowledging that properly was to be giving equity away, and it may well be that the whole lot goes to those who are coming up through the firm. In short,
well, I don't think we could end on a more profound note, Adam. That was really, really insightful, and I really appreciate your time. And I think that anybody I wouldn't say this to everybody, but it sounds like anybody working for you has got a boss with the right outlook.
Well, that's very kind, Sam. Very kind.
Yeah, thank you very much. I really, really enjoyed that.
Good. Well, pleasure to speak to you.
Okay.